Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos una vez más al canal de YouTube del Instituto Cervantes in Manchester and Leeds. Welcome once again to the YouTube channel of Instituto Cervantes in Manchester and Leeds. In this series, first of all, I would like to inform you, as you have seen the image, that you can choose the language on which you want to follow the talk. It can be in English or you can choose also Hispanic, so it's up to you. And being said, welcome again. And first of all, to a very warm welcome to our guest, our special guest, Dr. Miguel Valero, and to our host, Dr. Rosi. Thank you for joining us, to being with us in a new event on this series. It's Libris Publications in Hispanic Studies, a series of talks that we have started. We are now in the third year, where we discuss the recent work of on the topic on contemporary Hispanic culture in British and American academia. This series would not be possible without the cooperation and support of Rosi, who is the coordinator of the series, and she is also the deputy head of the Department of Modern School of Language of the University of Durham, and she has been publishing in contemporary Spanish culture, film, literature, and she's also a very well-renowned scholar for the studies. Tonight, as I said, our special guest is Dr. Ángel Valero, who is assistant professor of Hispanic at Washington University in St. Louis in the United States. He's a scholar of the African diaspora in Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula, and he teaches in Afro-colonial culture and contemporary Afro-Latin American literature and culture. The research of Dr. Ángel Valero has focused on Black Catholic brotherhoods and confraternities and Afro-Creole festive practices in colonial Latin America, especially in the countries of Mexico and Brazil. His research has appeared in various academic journals, including Slavery and Abolition, Colonial Latin American Review, The Americans, and the Journal of Festive Studies. He is author of Sovereign Joy, Afro-Mexican Kings and Queens, 1539-1640, published in Cambridge University Press in 2022, is the book which is being launched today with us in Instituto Cervantes. And he's also co-editor of Indigenous and Black Confraternities in Colonial Latin America, Negotiating Status Through Religious Practices, which was published in Amsterdam University Press in 2022. Well, tonight we have the privilege to launch this magnificent book, Sovereign Joy, Afro-Mexican Kings and Queens, between 1539 to 1640, a book where it is explored the performance of festivity of Black kings and queens among the Afro-Mexicans in that period of time. And it's a fascinating study that illustrates how the first African and Afro-Creole people in colonial Mexico transformed their assertion culture into a shared identity among Afro-Mexicans, with particular focus on how public festival participation expressed their culture and subjectivities, as well as redefined their colonial condition and social standing. Before I pass the floor to Rosi, I would like to inform to you that, as usual in this series, we intend to establish a dialogue with the authors in which you or our audience is always very welcome. So we invite you to ask your questions in the chat. Our Professor Rosi will be the one to ask our guests. And without further ado, sin nada más que añadir, te paso la palabra, Rosi. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Pedro. Thank you again, Instituto Cervantes, for hosting this conversation. And thank you, Miguel, for accepting our invitation to be here. Thank you for joining us in this conversation and accepting our invitation to talk about your book. And before I start, congratulations on your last award for this book. You have received the Howard F. Klein Book Prize in Mexican History given by LASA. I know that you've been recently in Colombia. I don't know if you were present at the award ceremony, but congratulations and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to orient our conversation today in more general terms. Your book is so rich in information and detail, incredible research, imagery, and really suggestive reading of a very important period in colonial history. But I suspect our audience might not be as specialized in this topic or in this period. So I would like to invite you to offer some more general, perhaps, context to your answers and just give us some ideas and resources that you explore in your project. So let's start with a brief introduction to your book with a very simple question. What is it about? Who and what were the festive kings and queens?
First of all, thank you, Rosi, and thank you, Instituto Manchester, Pedro, for organizing this, for inviting me, and everyone who's supporting us behind the scene. So the book, when I was in grad school, my advisor, Lisa Voy, I was writing a book about festivals in mining town. My advisor designed this class on colonial cities and festivals, and we read this account of the celebration in Mexico City in 1539, celebrating the Truce-Tunis, where Charles V had won over the French when they were fighting for the Italian peninsula. It's a whole different story. But in this account of this festival in Mexico City, I found this sentence that says, and there were more than 50 Black men and women all on horseback with their king and queen. So I became curious about what is going on. I have never seen anything like that in any text I have read in all my years of studies. Unfortunately, Lisa was familiar with this tradition. And then she said, well, you need to look into this and this, which I did. So I discovered that there was this tradition of Black festive kings and queen throughout the African diaspora, and that there was somewhat significant literature for this tradition in Brazil, where it is still performed in Brazil, these confraternities, which we will get to later. And then Panama, New Orleans, there's even records of this in New England. So throughout the African diaspora, this tradition of festive kings and queens, where Black people would perform in both communal celebrations and big public celebrations, like the one in Mexico City, with a performance of a royal court led by a king and a queen, and then the people would pay homage to the kings and queens. And then I began to look for other Mexican texts that talked about this in Mexico City. And the only texts that I found were from Mexico City, but I found 3 other festival accounts. There was a 1610 festival and a 1640 festival. And then I found another case where it's several archival documents that are problematic. In any event, I found these sources for the 16th and early 17th century, and all the literature I had been reading had been studied this tradition in the 18th century. So it turns out that the sources that I have found from Mexico were the earliest sources for this tradition in the Atlantic. So I began to think, what does it mean, and what does this allow us to think about Mexico City and its place in the development of Black Atlantic culture, when this culture is present here from the beginning, because 1539 is very early in terms of the European colonization of Mexico. So the book is documenting that early development of this performance, but this performance for me speaks about a community that is there, a community that is building itself, sustaining itself, seeking joy, creating opportunities of joy. And that performance and that joy is part of the broader communities of joy that Afro-Mexicans were building at the time in Mexico City.
Okay, so then let's talk about the title of your introduction. It actually says, Thinking Black Joy, Sovereignty, and Being from Colonial Latin America. And I think this title indicates three very important words and concepts for your project. So I was wondering if you could break down them for us, especially in the context of your project that opens the study of early modern Atlantic and the broader history of racialization of Blackness.
Yes, so thank you for that question. And so I wanted to think, and I wanted the book to be an invitation for those of us, for anyone who's concerned about history and culture, to think about Black joy, Black sovereignty, and Black being. So these are, in this case, the approach is philosophical in terms ontological, right? Mm-hmm. Is Black joy possible in a slave society, right? Do these examples show a joy that is not really joyful because it's created in this world and it's not truly joyful, it's not authentic joy, or is it really an authentic joy? And so I was finishing the book in 2020, so I was also thinking about the moment in which I was finishing the book and what I was reading about that moment and other instances in terms of Black communities seeking joy even in these difficult moments, because joy sustains them in the struggle, right? Mm-hmm. And to think of the history of Blackness not as a history, not only as the social death of slavery, but because that is not to look at the history of Blackness from the Black perspective, right? If we think macro-philosophically, if you will, metaphysically, every community seeks joy, right? So why wouldn't Black community seek joy? Why wouldn't that joy be authentic? And of course, because this performance was kings and queens, and it was problematic sometimes, and Mexico was the only place where Black people were executed for this tradition, what kind of sovereignty is being performed here? It's a performance of sovereignty. One of the arguments I make in the book is about a communal sovereignty, insofar as through these confraternities, Black communities in Mexico City and throughout the Atlantic were self-sufficient insofar as they were the only one who provided for their own care in time of sickness, for burial, and other forms of aid. So you could rely on the help of your brotherhood if you had legal issues, which in the Spanish Empire, as you may know, you could sue for different reasons, even if you were an enslaved person. And then you could rely on your confraternity to help you purchase your freedom, which is another thing that's available. So they provide the safety net, and it's the only safety net that Black people had in early modernity, as far as I have been able to see in my study. So that's what I call the communal sovereignty, right? To think of sovereignty that is going on with the colonial project is about imperial sovereignty, but what other sovereignties are possible within the big sovereignty. And then to think about being, right, the philosophical, right, because I was thinking about, the idea that slavery means social death, right? So the death of the being, for example, if we think we live in a Hegelian world, if we think, right, the way I like to put it is, what are philosophers afraid of? Philosophers are afraid of nothingness, and there's this Black philosopher who equates nothing with blackness. A philosopher afraid of blackness, of black being, right? So the Western world. So I was in 2020 thinking about the Western world, and the Western world is afraid of black being, right? Of an affirmation of humanity from the people we had sought to subjugate, right? And it could be black, it could be indigenous group, non-white groups, right? But then also it was for anyone reading the book, both from Latin America and outside Latin America, to think of colonial Latin America as a site where that was also possible. And how was that possible? And what does that tell us about our history and the Black history in Latin America, to think of Latin America as an important site of this Black action as well?
Thank you. And thinking about sort of that history, and actually, I think that you already mentioned sort of its disappearance. Can you tell us more about the Afro-Mexicans per se, and sort of their disappearance or erasure, perhaps, from these colonial archives? And I think that a term that you use is also creolization when talking about race and racial relations in Mexico in the colonial period. Could you explain or expand on this idea? Because I think you have very particular, your own point of view, I guess, in this discussion.
Right. So this is where I was thinking about the field in which I am, which is literature, and thinking about Latin American colonial literature, where from the beginning of that field in the 20th century, when they talk about Creole culture, they meant white Creole culture, right? And when we look at the etymology of the word Creole, it was a word used in Brazil and in the Portuguese Empire for a house slave, right? And then it has that genealogy, right? So I wanted to bring the word back to its origin, but also to invite those of us who do colonial literature or early modern literature and talk about Creole culture, to think back at what Creole culture meant. It meant not only this white culture, not only this European culture, but the coming together of these three cultures, right? And the Black is a constituent component of that culture that developed. And I study festivals, and so I can talk about festivals. I haven't found a colonial festival that doesn't include all the groups that are present in that community, right? And that's what Creole culture means, that all the cultures are contributing to this Latin American culture in the making. So in a sense, if we go to the question of disappearance, one way that Creole culture disappears from our imaginary is when literary study erases it, right? I think there's someone a long time ago who said that there was nothing culturally important about Black culture for the literary world, right? There was nothing of value. So I was trying to fix that, or invite people to rethink that position, right? To rethink our cultural heritage, also beyond the literary. And you can see all the images I use, and rethinking archival sources as beyond the printed word, right? And then in the disappearance that I talk about in the conclusion of the book is that in the Mexican archive, the tradition of Black kings and queens doesn't appear again after 1640.
Okay.
In the Mexican archives, it's a question I struggle with. It's kind of symbolic because 1640, as you may know, is the end of the Iberian Union. Spain had usurped Portugal. Portugal has reasserted itself, however you want to see it. But during this period is when most people were enslaved from Central Africa, West Central Africa, Angola, and the Congo. And this festive tradition of Black kings and queens has been linked to that region. So it's kind of symbolic that it ends in Mexico, in the Mexican archive, right at the moment that kind of the slave trade from Angola and the Congo also ends because then we move to the Kingdom of Dahomey, what is Nigeria and Benin today, and then the Dutch and other empires come into the trade. But also, again, I was trying to, because the erasure of Black culture in Mexico, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, when they see this book or when I talk about this book, Black people in Mexico? What do you mean? So also an invitation to think about what they call in Mexico, those who know about it, la tercera raíz, right? The third root of Mexican culture. So if you think agua de Jamaica and horchata, these are Black things that Black people gave Mexico that are so Mexicans today, and hardly anybody knows that they are of African origin. So that was also inviting to rethink how we think of Mexico, also how we think of mestizaje, right? How we think of the mestiza nation, and how mestizaje can erase Blackness and about the history of Mexican culture.
Thank you. And I think that now that you talk about sort of those traces, right? And I think it really speaks to my next question, because I was fascinated with the visual material that you present in your book. Unfortunately, they were black and white, but I wish you've seen them in color, I bet. And I don't know if those images are available somewhere else, but I liked your invitation and your reading of the material culture present in the lives and experiences of these performances and celebrations, and clearly in these illustrations as well. So how would you explain or tell us why it's important to think about this material culture? Why is it in this context so important to think about, to take into account, to analyze them, and so on?
Yeah, so that has to go, goes to the question of sovereignty, of self-sufficiency, of being a player in colonial society, right? Not being a powerless group, right? That they have economic agency that allows them to stage these lavish festivals. And for example, 1610, the one I study in chapter 3, it's a big festival for the beatification of Ignatius of Loyola. But we are told in the account of that festival that the Black people, that the Black groups, the different Black groups that offer performances outshine everyone else, right? And that's something we don't find in many texts, but we find this text here. And there's another, well, of course, there's another in chapter 4 that also tells us, because if you look for them, but it's this economic agency, this material culture. So again, also an invitation to think beyond the text, because I use the text as a starting point to see what we can recuperate about this culture. So in the 1610 festivals, 2 Black groups build a triumphal cart, carro sacramental, which if you study Baroque literature, autos sacramentales, you know about these and all the triumphal carts that were built. And then the other one is an elephant. It's a wooden elephant that they take into the Zócalos. Also, these festivals, they took place in the Zócalo, in the main square in Mexico City. And then this elephant is full of fireworks and bombs and all kinds of things. And then they disperse the people and they blow it up, right? So this so there's at the time of this festival, there is a language that you speak through material culture, right? So the things you do to these material display of economic agency, which is also social and political agency. So I wanted to think along those lines about, thinking about Black culture. Well, they didn't write any, well, we don't have any, they didn't publish any magnum opus. Well, they did this magnum opus, right? Which I still want to reconstruct at least this elephant, blow it up, which is also a very Buddhist gesture. And in terms of the color images, yes, I couldn't get the editors to do it in colors. Same thing with the second book. But Yale has this journal, is the Material Culture of Religion Math Core. And there I did a small piece specifically to publish these images, some of the images in color, because it does make a difference. The images are very vibrant. And the reason why I use the images, a lot of the images, and engage with the images, I'm very lucky to have friends in art history who told me, just don't put the image in the book. You have to look at the image and see what the image is saying. They also complement the text, especially in the Mexican text, that sometimes don't give us a lot of great detail. So they complement the images, especially chapter 1, which is on one sentence. And I was lucky enough that there is a great deal of visual culture about this tradition and related traditions from the Atlantic world. So also those of us who are thinking transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, right? There is the written word, but there's also other material is available to us to give the fullest picture we can of the tradition.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that engagement with the images, because you really do spend a fair amount engaging with them. And I think that's quite extraordinary, because you really invite us to think in different ways, right? And let's stay a little bit longer with that question, because I want you to tell us about one of the festivities that actually involve women. And how do you think does gender matter in this material culture? Were you able to notice some differences or some particularities because this festivity was actually organized by women?
Yeah, so that's chapter 4, and in 1610, the text doesn't talk about women, but women have to be there. But then 1640, the text is all women. It's a group of 12 women, but also those women are supported by their community, right? It's one of my argument. So in terms of the tradition of Festa of Black Kings and Queens, the performance that they did, where the people pay homage, there's very little for us to go on, but there is a general understanding that the women have more performative power. So, for example, the way it's done in Panama, the king doesn't speak. It's only the women that speak. And then in the example in Mexico City in 1539, it says, and they pay homage to the queen. And then I use that to think about the role of women, of Black women in colonial society. And those of us who focus on Black communities in colonial times talk about that women have more relative freedom because women bodies were less suspect than men's body, right? So a black male body was very suspect. It could be a dangerous thing if allowed too much freedom. So women had, they own more property than men. So this economic agency allowed them to also, right, stage this performance, represent the community as women, communicate what these performances were often trying to communicate to the powers that be, which was that the Black community was a loyal community and to ingratiate themselves with authorities. And this is precisely what the women are doing in 1640. But also, it allows us to see women at the forefront, right, of Black communities, which we know if we study Black communities in the United States in the 20th century and other spaces, we can see. So this long tradition of Black women being at the forefront, it is a causality of the colonial condition where men are given less freedom and women have. But also, one of the things that I look at the book is how Black communities what they do with the freedom they're given, right? And they take advantage of that freedom, one, to stage his performance, to build community, to take care of themselves. And women are at the forefront of that.
All right. So let's think about those supportive communities. And you talk a lot about these confraternities. And also sort of what they allow, right? Or they help in these sort of festivities, and also sort of the dual nature and perception of these festivities, right? Because as you explained, actually very engagingly, these performances were both celebrated, but also seen as with suspicion, right? And even actually this, led to violent act towards, Black bodies. So I was wondering if you can think about sort of that supportive community and sort of that relationship or sort of that perception of these festivities, and how these communities both sustained, protected, or perhaps they also became the target of sort of this violence.
Yes, Constance, yeah, thank you for that question. And it connects to the question of freedom, and also the moments of violence that happen against this performance of this tradition of Black communities, where this tradition was involved in Mexico, were also very vulnerable moments for Mexico in itself, right? So in 1608, the viceroy gets called to Madrid. He becomes the president of the Council of the Indies. And then so from 1608 to 1612, there is no viceroy. So it's a very unstable period. And we have similar periods before where it's very unstable. There is no viceroy, and everyone is very tense. And this is partly what happens in Mexico City in this period. But generally, so the confraternities were these Black groups. They were Catholic, lay people, and it was the only way that the Black people could organize in the Catholic world, because they couldn't become priests, they couldn't become nuns. So the only options they had was to join these confraternities, and then they used these institutions to build this community of support that I call communal sovereignty. But because both the church, not so the church is the hierarchy, the church hierarchy, and colonial officials, and this is clearly in the documents, as I discuss in the book, they say that the confraternities is one of the too many freedoms that Black community have. So I do an analysis of the racialization, right, of this general perception that Black people shouldn't have freedom, right? They shouldn't have what is called in the document too much freedom. So there's always opposition to confraternities from the hierarchy, from the church, and from the colonial officials. Then it is the missionaries and actually the Spanish crown, because the king favors confraternities. Because from the viewpoint of the missionaries and the Spanish crown, these confraternities allow Black people to assimilate to Iberian society, right? So that's essentially why they're allowed. And then what other people don't like is what they do with them, which is build this community of support, have these performances, and also have private parties. So they have communal parties, communal celebrations. So one of the texts that I study is Christmas 1608, and a large group of Afro-Mexicans have gathered in the house of this woman. It's called a house, but from the context, we can understand that it was the usual gathering place. It's owned by these Black free women, which again speak to women. And it's a place where they gather to eat and be together, right? The documents say gamble and drink, but maybe happen. But, everybody may have been doing that. In any event, so there's that tension. And this is one of the tensions that I was trying to understand in the book. Why is this so dangerous when it happens outside the festive space, but it's sought out? Because we know that whenever there was a public festival, they want a Black group to perform, and they allow Black groups to perform with the king and queens. Of course, those of us may know that the Baroque is perhaps the age of contradiction like no other. And this is one of the big contradictions, is that you can come with your performance to our official festival, but don't do it when we're not watching, right? So there's also thinking about, they want to have this control that they can't have, right? And this speaks also to why the colonial project ultimately fails everywhere, is because you can't have this ultimate control over the communities, because these communities are wise, they're smart, and they're creatively taking advantage of freedoms to build these supportive communities.
Thank you. That was really interesting, sort of that account and your reconstruction of that moment. I know that some of our listeners might have questions, so I want to prepare them to think about their questions and perhaps use the comment section to start typing while I sort of wrap up this part of the conversation. When you started explaining your project, you said that you were led by your dissertation advisor, Lisa Voigt, who showed you sort of a little bit of the ropes and showed you these are the things to read and so on. But as you were doing that journey of learning and discovery, what was most surprising to you? What did you find that you didn't expect? And what you didn't find that you were expecting to find?
Yes, so thank you for that question. I will answer the second part first, because in that 1539 account, which is written by Bernal del Castillo, he says in his account that 2 accounts of the festival were sent to Spain. So I spent a lot of time looking for these accounts that were sent to Spain. I haven't found any trace of these accounts. Naturally, I mean, you hear a document says that something was sent to the king. You look for it, and you don't find it. The whole tradition of festive kings, I mean, how widespread it was, and the fact that it was that there was more than one Mexican document that talked about it, that there were multiple documents, and that these documents were many of them, all except for the one in chapter 4, they're all digitally available, but no one had stopped to look at them. The 1612 is studied a lot, but not as not from the perspective of Black kings and queens. It's studied as a post-rebellion, which was one of my objectives. Was a lot of people have looked at this event, but no one has looked at what is clearly there. Is that so because I found other sources, I was able to put that question forward. But look, there's this whole other tradition that is being mentioned here. What is going on here? So I'm finding this whole tradition of Black kings in the age of slavery, in a world that wasn't supposed to be happening, right? Black joy, Black sovereignty. I mean, it kind of changed my whole, my whole view and of history and the Blackness, and how we should look and think about Blackness, right? So,
yeah, and I think that one of the points that you make actually is precisely that these festivities were looked and mentioned, but it's very different when you bring the lens to them, and that's the object of your research, right? How it changes their meaning, their interpretation, and so on. Yeah. So do you think that in this process you self-taught yourself a lot?
Yes, I taught myself a lot. I mean, I'm going to get personal, but I was born in the Dominican Republic. If you're born in the Dominican Republic, the Dominican Republic has this very difficult and fraught relationship with Haiti, right? So if you're Dominican, you're taught to think of yourself as white. But look at me, I'm not white. So it was also a journey of self-discovery. I felt like I was discovering part of my roots, part of my history. So the project had for me a huge personal load, and that gave it for me a huge ethical responsibility to do it right, to do it justice, because of that personal dimension that I felt attached to it. And it has been very joyous.
Yeah, I think that you can tell that in your writing. There's a lot of a pain sort of discovering this story, but there is also such an effort there to find joy and to sort of grasp on that idea and that experience that I think it's really valuable. I learned a lot reading your work, so thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm glad it came through.
Yes, it did. I don't know if we have any questions from our audience. I do have a few more questions. I don't see if anyone is typing. I'll give a minute. If not, I'm happy to go on. We'll, have you here for myself. I'm thinking about your project because I think that in your book, you also launch, lanzar preguntas, and I wonder who will sort of pick up a lot of those gloves that you, throw in that project. And I was thinking about your project and along with the other recent ones from young scholars. And I'm thinking here about Nick Jones' project, for example. We actually talked about his book in our series. I think it was one of the early years of our series. And I think that your work and in these sort of young generation of scholars that are coming through right now are expanding in important and groundbreaking ways our understanding and knowledge of the Black experience in early modern Iberia and sort of East Atlantic expansion. I feel like it's in that sort of moment, right? I think that when I was coming through grad school, it was gender, and it was sexuality. We were discovering a lot of things about subjectivities, right? And I think here is sort of the next chapter of that sort of scholarly, perhaps, evolution. How do you see this work developing and evolving in the next few years or decades? Or what's your wish for it? Where do you want to take this task? To what point so the next generation can pick it up?
Yeah, so I mean, Nick Jones has a new book coming out on Cervantes Blackness, right? So Cervantes from a Black perspective. Your colleague Lexi Cook has a great book on the fetish, or not the fetish. So we have so many people in my generation whose book have come out or are coming out, or for dissertation are being transformed into book. And as I mentor young scholar myself, because I cannot look at the whole, we cannot look at the whole thing. When I wasn't able to go to LASA, so I presented about the book. I received the prize virtually, but then a person got up and asked me questions and made a comment about the Yunga in Bolivia. So it's this Afro diaspora community that went to live with indigenous people and develop this Afro indigenous culture in Bolivia. And they had celebration of kings and queens. Kings and queens were everywhere, right? And confraternity was everywhere. And so happily, the moment has come where I think Hispanic studies have realized that, it's time to look at the whole picture. And we have neglected the Black component of the culture for so long. And the due time has come. I'm very happy for that. And so happy to, to mentor a young scholar and to look at other places and other regions. And if somebody wants to look at my sources and do something else with that, absolutely happy for that as well. Just very happy to be to just start something that goes places. So I'm very happy and hopeful for the future of the field as it grows. Boletín de Comediantes, they just published the double issue of the consensus. We did in Yale. At Yale, my piece ended up not. I couldn't get my head around it in time but one day we'll get so there's so many projects. Diana Berrueso and Manuel Govante have this project on Black Iberia. So it's growing, and it's and also these transatlantic dialogues also are very helpful for me and for yeah.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that you mentioned in this growing, and I want to sort of recover that idea of the erasure and sort of, you know, that what Blacks in Mexico said, that kind of question. And you think if there are all this work being done, it means there are sources and materials to be looked at. So how were they sort of under the radar? Were people not looking at the right places? Is this a question of framing? What do you think? Is that a moment, or are we in a cultural moment? How would you explain that?
It was a question of interest. So literary and cultural scholars of the early modern, I mean, there was always, you know, Castellanos, you know, wrote about Black. There were always people writing about Black characters in Comedias del Siglo de Oro. So there were always one or two people. There was, but generally, at the big picture, there wasn't much interest in that. Perhaps people thought that there weren't sources. I think also there has to do with the methodological development in the field, right? Maybe we didn't have the tools back then. We had not developed yet the tool. You know, the way that Nick Jones is looking at it, you know, all the theoretical framework that he's using to do it, because there was a problem both in the peninsula and in Latin America. I mean, people were not interested, generally interested in that. But the sources were always there, waiting. They were lying in wait. And now we have, for what was done in the field, we have this rich methodological toolbox, gender study, race studies, all these great methods that allow us to now produce a richer reading of the sources. So maybe they were waiting for their time. But I think there was generally there was no interest. People thought, you know, it wasn't worth it until something came along. But I think that who ushered that moment, at least in Latin America, were the historians, because historians in Latin America were looking at the Black colonial experience. So most of the, you know, a lot of the books you see behind me are histories of Blackness in Latin America and beyond. So even in Brazil, I haven't found anyone in literature in Brazil studying Black culture, but the historians are studying Black culture. So they have been, I think, and they played an important role for us and made some of those sources, you know, available.
Right, they paved the way. Pedro.
Yes, I would like to put a question regarding the visibility or the present day festivities of kings and queens. That is something you mentioned. Brazil is very, very present in Minas Gerais, especially in Salvador de Bahia. How about in Mexico? You have also mentioned countries like Bolivia. Those festivities are still being celebrated as rituals that take place in different dates of the year, or is something that stay in history rather than in the present day?
The ritual in Mexico, not so much, but son jarocho and fandango. So I have a friend who's studying music, Black music in Mexico. So you know, para bailar la bamba is son jarocho, and son jarocho and fandango. You can look in the documents. You can find it. You can find it, and when you find fandango in the 16th or 17th century, the only people dancing fandango are Black people, right? And you can retrace this history of these Black traditions. In Bolivia, the carnival in Oruro, they're very aware that it's that has a lot of Afro influence, and there are studies being done. The kings and queens, of course, in Brazil, they're very common. In Panama, what is happening now is that they're performing it for cruise people. So whenever a cruise comes into port, which is I think an interesting project that somebody else needs to take on, which is
else, yeah.
how tourism affects culture, because I just came back from Cartagena, and both in Cartagena and San Basilio de Palenque, tourism has become an important source of income. So the traditional culture, the way they would dress for special day, or the rituals they would have performed on special days, are now being performed on a daily basis for tourists, because it's an important source of income. So you know how tourism is affecting. About the Congo in Panama, there's an article, "The Gringos Are Coming." But so yeah.
That's really interesting. I think sort of the whole cultural heritage linked with tourism, that would be like a really good project for someone
Yes.
out there. Yeah, absolutely. So your final question, Miguel, what's your next project?
So I'm working, I'm writing a book on Brazil. So in Brazil, the confraternities, they were more numerous because Brazil had a way larger Black population. And for a longer time, I'm looking at the 18th century. The question is around space, ritual space. So in Brazil, these confraternities were able to build more than 50 churches in the 16th and 17th century, which nowhere else were they able to do that. So there's a question about economic agency, what they did. But also, when they build their own church, they own that space. So the question is, what does it mean for a Black community to own their space? They have their own archives, which was a question in Mexico. In Mexico, there were no documents produced by the Black cofradías themselves. You have some documents in Lima, but I couldn't find any documents in Mexico City produced by the confraternities. Where in Brazil, I cannot go through all the documents, there are too many. So I'm looking at that, architecture, art, some festivals, so ritual space, and the question is now is becoming about placemaking.
Yeah. Okay.
Which in a sense is related to the second book, but more direct about how you build place by building a place, and then from that place build this theoretical placemaking.
Yeah, I really like that. So when you say space, you don't seem to indicate land. When they were building these places, were they also owning land, or just that space?
They eventually owned the land on which the church sat, and so we have documents. Often they asked the crown, so it was land that was owned by the crown. So we have when that was the case, we have the documents when they asked the crown several times to reiterate that the land was theirs, because of course people were trying to take it away from them. But also in Brazil, it's well documented that one of the source of income was real estate, investments in real estate. So the one in Salvador that is very famous that people go to, at the beginning of the 19th century, that brotherhood, they owned 30 houses that they rented out. So that was an important source of income that financed the activities that the brotherhood had.
Okay, we're gonna have to invite you back to tell us when the book is written, right, Pedro?
Yes. So
Thank you so
interesting.
much again, Miguel, for sharing your work with us. Thank you to our audience and the Instituto Cervantes again for creating and hosting these conversations. Again, we finished speaking about space, and I really do appreciate the space that we're given within sort of the cultural community of the Instituto Cervantes. We will be off during the summer, but we will be back in the fall with one more conversation with Raquel Medina and Barbara Zecchi on their work on film and aging. So thank you again, Miguel. Thank you, Pedro, and have a good summer, everyone.
Thank you, Rosi. Thank you, Miguel, for this wonderful talk, and see you after the summer.
Yes. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Yeah.